about today's format before we start. We will be recording the event. You have just seen the permission window just come up. So feel free to turn on or off your camera at any time, however you feel comfortable. Please mute yourself while other people are speaking. There will be a Q&A after the talk. So during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function and only unmute yourself when I call on you to ask your question. Now you can also post your question on the chat and I will keep an eye out and make sure I ask those questions as well. You're very welcome and encouraged to use the chat during the talk, but please observe our community guidelines, which is going to be put on the screen right this moment. I also want to thank our communication coordinator, Aman Chandi, for helping us organize the talk. And she will also be there to help you on the chat if you run into any issues. So please put on the chat if you're unable to find anything. So now it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Holly Carribeau, who is currently the Jack and Nancy Farley Distinguished Visiting Scholar at SFU. And it's a great privilege for our department to host her. She's also an assistant professor of history at Oklahoma State University. Her research is so interesting. It focuses on the history of vice, labor, and sexuality in transnational urban spaces during the 19th and 20th centuries. Her first book, Sin City North, Sex, Drugs, and Citizenship in the Detroit-Windsor Borderland, examines the history of illegal economies in the Great Lakes border region during the post-World War II period. And the book received the Michigan State History Book Award. Congrats to Holly for that. She's also published many other articles and is the co-editor of a collection titled Border Policing, A History of Enforcement and Evasion in North America that came out in 2020. Dr. Carribeau's talk today will focus on her current book project, which examines the history of federal drug treatment facilities and the ways in which they were incorporated into a larger system of incarceration during the mid-20th century. So we're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Holly Carribeau.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction. And I thank you everyone for showing up on a Friday in the summer semester. So this is really great. The research I'll be discussing today is new, and I'm excited just to hear feedback and really have a conversation around it. I'd also like to thank Aman Chandi for helping to coordinate this and organize, and put sort of all the effort in there, as well as the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for promoting the programming. Thank you to the GSWS department and the history department for hosting the events. And I just really like to say thank you to the Farley Fellowship and Foundation more generally. This has been a really great experience, even though I've been holding the fellowship remotely from Oklahoma due to the COVID restrictions. But nonetheless, I've really enjoyed getting to know the students in the GSWS department, as well as faculty through SFU. So once again, thank you to everyone who's made this possible. So as Helen mentioned, the research that I'm going to discuss today is part of the broader book project that I'm currently working on. And so hopefully you can see the screen okay. And the talk today is titled Institutionalized Addiction, a case study of drug treatment approaches in the 1920s American West. But this is part of a history of a broader book project that looks at the history of the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm, which was one of only 2 federally funded drug treatment facilities open in the United States between the 1930s and 1970s. Approved by Congress in 1929, the Fort Worth Farm, along with its the second institution in Lexington, Kentucky, in many ways were groundbreaking facilities, emerging at a time when lawmakers, law enforcement officials, and the general public were increasingly calling for punishment models to treat addiction and drug use. These institutions attempted to provide a sort of modern, more compassionate, and more sophisticated approach to addiction treatment. And so, the opening of these facilities in the 1930s seemed to suggest that perhaps the federal government was making a move away from incarceration and towards a more comprehensive understanding of addiction. Yet punishment and treatment go hand in hand in the federal narcotic farms. And they quickly develop into sites of incarceration, places where men and women who were sentenced to prison-related crimes were held by the state. And so the broader book project traces the intertwined relationship between treating the addict and punishing the user. And I look at how these dual objectives play out at the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm, and ultimately the impact this had on both staff and patients. And here you can see in the screen is an aerial image of a postcard of the Fort Worth facility. Now, we often today think of treatment and punishment as two very different approaches, but scholars like Nancy Campbell, Carolyn Jean Acker, and Elizabeth Ettore have made the case that, in fact, we have to see medicalization and criminalization as, quote, co-constitutive and mutually reinforcing. And certainly this mutually reinforcing relationship takes place at the narcotic farm. And largely, historians have focused on the Lexington facility, which was larger, opened first, and treated users living east of the Mississippi River, so largely East Coast, the South, and the Midwest. But in fact, very little has been written about the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm, which treated patients living west of the Mississippi River, largely men, and largely from sort of Southwestern and Plains states. And so my research is situating the Fort Worth Farm within the regional sort of Southwest network in which the patients were, or inmates were incarcerated from. So I'm interested in using patterns in the Western region of the United States. And this hopefully will provide an interesting comparative look to the studies that have really been focused on major East Coast and Midwestern cities. But even further, and just to give you a visual here before I move on, so Lexington, which is at the bottom of your screen here, largely treated patients living in the East Coast region, whereas Fort Worth on the top, largely patients, you can't see California in this image, but largely from the states in the southern and western regions of the United States, or southwestern. But even further, studies of Lexington really are situated most directly within the fields of drug history and the history of medicine, leaving the institution's role in the development of a modern sort of criminal justice system in the mid-20th century underexplored. And so, historians like Heather Ann Thompson and Elizabeth Hinton and others have really focused on the ways in which the war on drugs impacted the incarceration rates in a post-1960s era. This is really framed as sort of the late 20th century development. So in my book, I'm hoping that by placing the history of addiction into conversation with mass incarceration studies, we can see how the punishment model was actually interwoven into so-called progressive treatment methods as far back as at least the 1920s and 30s. So for the purposes of today, though, I want to focus on the research that I've been working on for the last few months. That's going to make up one of the first two chapters of the book. And that is, how did we get to the creation of the federal narcotic farms? In order to understand this, we have to look at what was happening in the lead up at the state level in order to understand what pushes for this move for federal intervention. And so this is what I'm going to focus on today. And I'll begin with a short discussion about the impact of federal drug laws on medical treatment in the 19-teens and 20s. And then I'll turn to a comparative case study that looks at two hospitals that were opened in the Western United States. In fact, the only two drug treatment centers that were framed solely as addiction treatment hospitals. The one is the State Narcotic Hospital at Darlington in Oklahoma, and the other is the State Narcotic Hospital at Spadra in California. And what I'll do is outline a little bit about how they operated, and then come to some conclusions about what were the shared challenges at these two institutions and their longer term impacts, ultimately why they matter in terms of both treatment in the Western US as well as in the creation of the federal narcotic farm. And I also want to make a brief note about language. The meaning of the term addict has never been static and was hotly debated in the time period I'm studying, as it is today. And so in my chapters, I utilize the language of the primary sources, but I'm also aware that labels like addicts have medical, legal, and moral implications. Throughout my work, I'm attentive to heed sort of Paul Gutenberg's warning that that we're careful about, quote, talking like the state, or of, simply reifying the categories that are built into state institutions or by our historical subjects. And so I hope in this talk, and especially in the wider book, to really interrogate this notion of the label addict and to recognize that it was very much embedded within power dynamics that included gender, race, ethnicity, and class ideologies. But I want to begin by just studying a bit of a broader context. It's certainly beyond the scope of the time I have today to outline, the history of state and federal drug laws in the United States. But I do want to detail a little bit about some of the important legal changes that take place in the early 20th century and how that led to an institutionalization of drug addiction. In many ways, this institutionalization push was a response to sort of two key shifts that happened in the late 19th century. One of those is a shift in user populations, and the other is then the rise of federal policies aimed at curbing those populations and drug use patterns. So the use of psychotropic substance isn't new in the late 19th century and has a long history in North America. But the 19th century marks the beginning of a new sort of tumultuous chapter. What we see is that the expansion of the introduction of the hypodermic needle in the 1850s and the expansion of the patent medicine industry during the second half of the 19th century made more potent drugs like morphine, cocaine, and other opiates more readily available. Though these substances were accessible without a prescription, but doctors often introduced patients to them. So doctors regularly administered, say, opiate-laced cough syrups to patients with respiratory problems, or morphine for women experiencing menstrual cramps. And by the end of the 19th century, what we start to see is this combined expansion of both medically related and so-called recreational drug use as we understand it today, especially in the form of opium smoking, would lead to a substantial increase in the number of Americans who are consuming some form of drug. And here on the top part of the screen, you can see the cocaine toothache drops as one example of a patent medicine. But at the same time, this is happening as a political and moral reform movement is taking place across the nation. This diverse movement known as progressivism really ushers in a new era of federal activism. So the first state drug laws were actually at the local and state level. So, and the first being in the West in California in 1875. But progressives approached this as a national issue. On the one hand, they saw drug use and addiction as a direct consequence of the lack of oversight of big business, and especially pharmaceutical industries. On the other, they also saw this as the plight of the American city, rife with vice and crime, and in need of so-called purification. And so racial stereotypes linking Chinese immigrants to opium smoking, or in the American South, African Americans to cocaine use, help fuel broader public panics and push for tighter drug laws. And so by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, what we see is drug use has joined issues like prostitution, gambling, and alcohol as a key target of reformers. Now, for today's purposes, the most significant law that's passed is the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. And this fundamentally changes the relationships between citizens and a wide range of drugs. Now, it's officially a tax act, but in actuality, the law effectively made the possession of opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine without a prescription illegal. So essentially, with the stroke of a pen, thousands of users who for decades had been able to access these substances over the counter and legally found themselves subject to the reach of the criminal justice system. But the Harrison Act also transformed how the medical field approached addiction. So doctors had long debated the nature of addiction and certainly continue today. But the real question, was this a medical issue or a moral one? Should it be treated? Is it within the purview of the medical system and physicians, or is it a legal question for the legal system? And as Carolyn Jean Acker has shown in her research, physicians were deeply divided on this in the years after the Harrison Act. But the passage of the law ups the stakes in this debate. The Treasury Department, which was the enforcement, responsible for the enforcement of the Harrison Act, took a very hard-lined approach and began to target doctors who knowingly provided drug addicts, as they understood them, with narcotics. And by 1921, the Supreme Court has made several rulings that support this strict enforcement approach, particularly in relation to the medical community. And these combined rulings have a devastating impact on the relationship between users and the medical community. What this means for today's purposes ultimately is that by the 1920s, narcotics users are not only criminals under federal law, but they're also largely denied any substantial form of treatment and medical care. But there were a few notable exceptions that attempted to provide help in the wake of the Harrison Act. And two of those institutions, in fact, were in the South and Western United States, in the states of Oklahoma and California. Both states established state-funded narcotic hospitals dedicated solely to narcotics treatment. And so an examination of these two case studies demonstrate the challenges that the states faced in these shifting legal realities. And so what I'll do is outline sort of how they functioned and why ultimately their failures helped lead the call to federal intervention. Before I turn to the case studies, I just want to show a map so we kind of visually see and spatially see why this is important, at least why I agree this is important. The Fort Worth Narcotic Farm is located here in North Texas, in Fort Worth, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So sort of within the city, but near rural North Texas. The Darlington Institute in Oklahoma was opened in El Reno near Oklahoma City. And then Spadra, that I'll talk about next, is in California. And why this geography matters is these also became important smuggling routes and networks for users who connected with one another, as well as smuggling routes across the US-Mexico border. And the states of Oklahoma and California were among the top 5 states that would where patients came from that populated Fort Worth. So they're going to play an important role in the institution and using communities that opened in the 1930s. So I think these two hospitals provides an important opportunity to think about regionalism, given this context. And I do this in the larger project a bit more, but and I'm happy to speak about it in the Q&A. But let's start just briefly with Darlington. One question I had, of all the states in the West, why Oklahoma? It seemed an unlikely state, in fact, given its sort of recent state. You know, it's only incorporated in 1907 officially as a state. It's deep prohibition roots. And proponents of Darlington, in fact, sort of build on that prohibitionist argument. And they begin to argue that by the early 1920s, the state has a disproportionate number of users. Oklahoma, according to contemporary reports, ranked 8th in the nation in terms of the number of drug users, but it was only 21st in terms of population. Dr. J.H. Scott, who would go on to be the superintendent at Darlington, asserted that a conservative estimate was that there were somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 users in the state. Of course, these numbers are always fluid and can never be, truly accurate, but it was an estimation. Another news article describes that, quote, neither Texas nor Kansas is as much a dope state as Oklahoma. More violations of the drug regulations are found in Oklahoma than in any other state in this region. And so one of the questions is, what could account for this? And part of it is geography. Oklahoma sat quite literally at important crossroads, travel routes that linked Kansas, Texas, and then cities like Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and Fort Worth were certainly part of travel networks, but they also linked into broader routes that smuggling routes up across the US-Mexico border. So geographically, it was situated in a way that made smuggling more convenient. But it's also the center of a regional oil boom in the 1920s. And so what we see is there's a more transient user population. You get, largely male populations and boomtown conditions that many at least were pointing to as some of the reasons why we can understand the rise of drug use in this moment. And so what we see is, along with the boomtowns, Oklahoma City and Tulsa would become other important anchors within the state. And so I trace some of this in the broader chapter, but altogether what we see is there's this growing public sort of outcry and concern about drug use. And the Democratic governor, Jack Walton, pushes for the opening of the state-funded narcotic hospital as really kind of a pet project. And ultimately, the Ninth Congress would establish this institution in 1923. Now, many had hopes this would be a transformative institution. One news article boasted, quote, no similar institution maintained in any of the other states or the South, in the South or West. The state health commissioner similarly predicted, quote, there's no question that Darlington will fill a long felt need in Oklahoma, and it will ultimately grow into one of the largest and most beneficial institutions in the state. In fact, when it's announced to the public, more than 300 applications flood in right away, despite the fact they were only going to have 47 spots when it opens. Now, the state chose a site with much deeper roots in state making, power, and violence, and I explore that in the broader chapter. It was originally the site of what was the Darlington Indian Agency, an Indian school. It was later purchased by the Masons and turned into an orphanage. And then finally, the state would purchase it to make it into the Darlington Narcotic Hospital. And so it has a much larger sort of infrastructure that I think is important to that history as well. It was run by a head administrator and several physicians who oversaw the treatment program. They had about 14 staff and a handful of guards to maintain the carceral presence. And this reflects the fact that Darlington was designed to house both voluntary and prisoner patients. So each county was allocated one slot at Darlington, and the county boards, which consisted of a judge, a health officer, and an attorney, would determine who would be sent from each county. And proponents of Darlington argued this was a quick, a streamlined, and economical way to incarcerate and treat addicts. Importantly, county boards did not have to provide due process through the court system. The state vested them with the authority to determine who was an addict and therefore who should be sent to Darlington and incarcerated there. Each patient inmate was incarcerated for a minimum of 6 months, and medical staff would determine when they were released. Now, the treatment program itself was designed around a drug reduction program, where patient inmates were administered gradually reduced doses of narcotics within an institutionalized setting. It was, in theory, to be carefully controlled in a centralized state institution. So this is one of the buildings that, there's several buildings that may have served as the central ward. So here's an example of what that would have looked like. Upon intake, medical staff would assess each patient, and then you'd be assigned a set ward based on the custodial control they thought that you would require. And so the trustee ward, as they called it, which was on the first floor, housed and incarcerated patients that required the least amount of supervision and care. The women's ward occupied the second floor. And on the third floor, or the third ward, is where they incarcerated what they considered to be the most severe or problematic patient inmates. When not confined to wards, patients perform menial duties like cleaning, yard work, and kitchen duty. And at a designated time each day, as part of the reduction program, a nurse or guard would administer each patient inmate their allotted shot or narcotic shot. You could socialize men and women together, in fact, for up to 6 hours a day in the yards. They had exercise opportunities. And ultimately, you'd maintain this relatively lax schedule until medical staff deemed that you were ready for discharge. Now, so Spadraw, on the other hand, it shares some similarities with Darlington in terms of its structure and function. Like Darlington, it was in part a response to shifting local conditions, a concern about growing drug use rates in the state of California. And in fact, the state had been a center of importation through cities like San Francisco and also across the US-Mexico border since at least the mid-19th century. Overcrowding in penal institutions, as well as the targeting of doctors for treating patients, eventually brought a broad coalition of voices together to push for an official state hospital for addicts. Opened in August of 1928, it was situated on a state-owned property that was known as the Pacific Lodge, which was the home for what was termed the feeble-minded at the time. And so it was built into the sort of carceral medical setting. And it was in Los Angeles County in what was Spadraw, which is now Sonoma. The property, had one large housing building, and eventually it would house up to 100 patient inmates, had an industrial building, a gym, and other infrastructure. Importantly, though, one of the first things they do when they open Spadraw is to build a 14-foot fence around the 5 acres at the core of the institution, speaking to the carceral elements of this institution. And so Spadraw operates under similar guidance or at least objectives as Darlington: segregate users from their communities that they deemed problematic, place them in a carceral setting under control of the state, use a reduction method to wean them off narcotics, and then hold them until medical authorities deems them releasable. But unlike Darlington, Spadraw only housed prisoner patients who had been sentenced there through the state's court system. And Spadra only treated women on an outpatient basis in much fewer numbers. Partly they were concerned about mixing across gender, and they didn't want to have to pay to build a women's ward. And so it was a similar intake process. The grounds were similar, but Spadra had a stricter work regimen where you would be working up to 8 hours a day. It could be in the industrial training center or other aspects of the community or of the institution. And they viewed this as a really essential part of the rehabilitation process, moral uplift through hard work. And so prisoners were expected to remain at Spadra for a minimum of 8 months, up to 2 years. Most significantly, Spadra actually implemented an outpatient release program, which is actually pretty ahead of its time in the way that it operated. They would secure work for parolees, and they would then monitor them for up to 16 months by keeping, tabs on families and trying to ascertain whether or not they've returned to drug use. And if they didn't, within 16 months, then they'd be released from the parole program. And so Spadra's treatment was designed to embody several elements of a modern addiction program, combining physical rehabilitation, occupational therapy, and aftercare supervision. In theory, they defined addiction as a medical problem that could, with proper professional care, be treated. Yet like Darlington, the realities of implementing this program are much more difficult, and realities look much different on the ground. As you can read in this image, a group of addicts at Spadra showing splendid physical rehabilitation. So this is promoting the program, a cured addict on duty at the entrance of Spadra. So here they're promoting their own treatment agenda. But for the remainder of my talk, what I want to do is outline a few commonalities between these institutions, one that highlight the limit to their treatment model. 3 issues in particular, I think, were shared across these institutions, despite some of their differences. First, both of them blurred the line between treatment and incarceration. And ultimately, in doing so, they really undermined their ability to successfully meet either mandate. From the perspective of the carceral setting, administrators at both institutions regularly complained that the facilities were ill-equipped to hold prisoners in any effective manner. Escapes from both institutions were common. And pretty strikingly, during the first 2 years in operation, between 30 and 34% of inmates escaped from Spadra. And so this is something that really concerned administrators seeking control. Patient inmates regularly smuggled drugs into the institutions. This was another common complaint. And so, though it was supposed to maintain this carceral aspect, it never reached the level of sort of jail, prison, or penitentiary. And so for administrators, they felt this really undermined their ability to be sort of fully in control of the environment. From the perspective of patient inmates, that carceral setting, though more lax than, say, a federal penitentiary, still was ever present and disruptive to a treatment program. Complaints are common from patient inmates at the facilities. At Darlington, for example, patients complain about abuse, about lack of adequate food, or cold drinking water in the sweltering Oklahoma summers. And so this meant the carceral presence for many that were sent to these institutions really overshadowed the hospital aspect. And ultimately, both institutions would have very high recidivism rates. Here you can see is just one chart from the California Interim Committee about the rates of recidivism or returning to drugs at Spadra. But just to give you one example, at Spadra, after 3 years in operation, a study found that about half of the men returned to drug use within the first 6 months of parole. After 12 months, only 36 paroles for more than 12 months had remained off of drugs. So their very mandate was unsuccessful. Darlington, it was run for such a short amount of time, it's harder to know those stats, but administrators did complain that there were patients who were in and out of treatment programs and prisons, even after being at Darlington. So they're not meeting their treatment mandate if we take that for the central goal. Second, though they frame these as treatment centers, both institutions expand the power of the state to incarcerate drug users. In the case of Darlington, the creation of those county boards vested with the authority to incarcerate users against their will represented an important expansion of state power. You didn't have to be charged for drug-related crimes to be sentenced through the county boards. And so what we see is they're essentially now embedding civil commitment in their approach to drug users. At Spadra, though they did go through the court system, the low success rates at the institution urged lawmakers to call for stricter enforcement methods that would allow them to more easily incarcerate addicts. And California legislature does precisely this in 1929 when they expand the vagrancy law to include addicts. So now you could be picked up on vagrancy, which didn't require that police had found you or charged you with possession or dealing. Simply being on the street, or essentially criminalizing homelessness in this case, or someone they deemed a vagrant, was now tied into the legal enforcement system of drugs. And so these failures were used as a way to justify an expansion of state power that really was not focused on medical treatment. But finally, and I think most significantly, what we see is a growing pessimism, even among the staff at these two institutions, that users were even worth treating. And what we see is it contributes to what historians have identified as a deepening public perception that users were necessarily, and addicts were necessarily linked to criminality. The initial optimism at Darlington fades, and as the accusations of abuse and mismanagement circulate. In the wake of these circulating rumors, one journalist from the Oklahoma News decided to go undercover at Darlington for 8 nights. And he writes a 4-part series, essentially an expose of what was happening. And here is the cover page. You can see he went undercover as what they called a snowbird or a cocaine user. And in his 4-part series, he describes the people he encounters there as, quote, pitiable human wrecks, and argues to the readership that these were just people there to get a cheap fix, that it was cheaper for them to be there to get narcotics there and room and board than be on the street. And he argues that, quote, Darlington is not accomplishing its purpose. And these claims were then echoed by prominent politicians, including the now Governor Trapp, who instantly, when he takes office, moved to close the Darlington Institute. And so after only 16 months, this institute that was supposed to be transformative, according to initial reports, is closed by the state. Now, Spadra lasts much longer, but coverage of its operations also present patient inmates as largely irredeemable. The superintendent, Joyce, at Spadra, the very person in charge with the treatment program, openly declared to a California committee that, quote, we might truthfully say that most of our admissions can be characterized as the backwash of narcotic drug addiction. Joyce describes his own patients as the backwash, suggesting that the more officials worked within these institutions, the more they were convinced that these were untreatable patients. And we see this take on gendered elements as well. And here are the mugshots provided to the California Committee of so-called typical addicts. And you can see the choices in the pictures that they've used are really to identify them sort of as criminal. And what we see is that women had already had far fewer treatment opportunities or options within either California or Oklahoma. And so as perceptions that drug users were inherently criminal deepen in the 1920s, those opportunities disappear. Treatment officials at both institutions emphasized that the female addicts were among the most disreputable class, and that by and large, they were associated with prostitution. Now, unlike the middle and upper class users of the late 19th century who could be treated privately and sort of went under the radar in terms of public perception, these were highly visible, criminalized sort of women. The California Interim Narcotic Committee puts this starkly, quote, the majority of women addicts are prostitutes, therefore the small percentage they succeed in saving are of very doubtful value to society. And in fact, the committee explains that California actually did briefly try to open an institute solely for the incarceration and treatment of female addicts. But it proved to be, quote, so complete a failure that a fire which wiped it out was regarded by the community as an unfortunate occurrence. So literally female addicts as disposable is fitting within this broader narrative. And finally, after working at Spadra for 8 years, Superintendent Joyce actually would call for the creation of what was known as a colonization program. And what this was to be was it was basically a prison for addicts where they would be segregated from other prisoners. And that the California Interim Committee thought this was a great idea and recommended that addicts within the colonization program be sentenced to between 5 and 15 years. So an expansion of the number of years of incarceration. Now, the colonization program never materializes, but it shows that the state was ready to double down on incarceration over treatment. And even the medical officers in charge at these state hospitals were growing increasingly pessimistic about treatment approaches. And so just to conclude, I want to offer just a few ideas then of why this matters for the federal farms. What we see is that the imposition of federal drug laws in the progressive era really has a profound impact on the treatment approaches and opportunities for users across the country and in the US West. In the wake of the Harrison Act, users find themselves criminalized and treatment opportunities drastically diminished. And this is particularly true in Western states where there was already, where treatment opportunities were fewer and far between, unlike in some areas in the Northeast. The state-funded hospitals in Oklahoma and California provided really a rare attempt to address the lack of adequate addiction care in the region. But while initially conceived as modern and humane approaches to the state's drug problems, as they were framed, ones that would facilitate the treatment of addiction as a medical issue, these institutions ended up failing to meet those mandates. Not only were recidivism rates high, but their failure would lead to calls for expanding state control over addicts and addict bodies. So despite the call for medical approach to addiction, these institutions, in fact, were needed to justify or used to justify an expanding carceral and law enforcement presence. Now, as federal and state prisons then continue to fill up by the end of the 1920s, what we see at fewer and fewer treatment centers open, again, Darlington closes by 1925. Spadro remains open, but it's really one of the few left in the nation. What we see is this starts to put pressure on the federal government to come up with some sort of interventive solution to deal with these sort of twin crises. In the end, what we see is the turn to federal intervention then was rooted in part in the challenges in localized treatment approaches faced, as well as the swelling number of men and women being incarcerated for drug and prohibition-related crimes by the 1920s. So in the remainder of the book then, I take these roots and trace how they expand into the Fort Worth farm, and ultimately how regionalism and networks and demographics will shift between the 1930s, the time when the Fort Worth farm is open, and the early 1970s. But I'd like to leave it there today and open up any questions or conversation or any feedback. I'm excited to hear. So.
Thank you so much, Holly, for a fascinating presentation. I invite the audience to, if you have a question, please use the raise hand function, and I'll look in the participants list to make sure that I don't miss you. And you can also type in your question on the chat. Maybe I'll give people a little time to think up their questions, and I'll just ask you, since I see a lot of graduate students in attendance, I'm wondering, would you be able to just maybe tell us a little bit about what is most challenging methodologically about doing this research? Like, where do you find your sources? What voices is difficult to hear, and maybe just give us an idea.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So in terms of sourcing, so that the nice part about working in the 20th century and working on institutions, federally documented institutions, is there is actually a ton of source material, in terms of institutional policies, numbers, of trying to get at sort of what life is actually like in the institutions becomes more challenging. Some of this, I think, for me, I am generally interested in the questions about how people experience these institutions, how we can understand not just sort of the goals from the top, but actually sort of the day-to-day operations. And so those become more challenging. Trying to find, for example, or sort of demographic shifts or comparative analyses between institutions when the same set of records don't exist can be, some of those challenges. But I think a lot of it is really, I've found, for example, some great oral histories that were done through Texas Christian University in the 1960s with people incarcerated at Fort Worth. So that can be one window into getting at sort of the voices of individuals. You can find, I guess there's sort of ways to mine some of those more traditional records and archives to try to piece together what is in some ways an institutional history, but to me, I'm really interested in social and cultural history. So why these institutions mattered to the people that were in them, the people that worked in them, and then how that was situated within the federal government. So it's the other, I should mention the other challenges when you're relying on, state-produced records. So you're relying on court records, arrest records, registers. These are records created by the state who have a particular mandate. Descriptions of users, for example, whether someone's a user or an addict as a word is really important and is not often distinguished or critically examined in the source itself. And so that is something that I'm always sort of really attentive to is not simply kind of reproducing what these sources are saying, but rather also critically engaging with what does it mean to label a woman, for a female user, for example, a sex worker or a prostitute in the language of the day. And so I think that that's a really critical part of dealing with these state sources, particularly because you're also dealing with records that are, dealing with people's lives at really difficult moments in them. And so I feel a real stake personally that, we're talking about humans who are grappling with all sorts of challenges. And so that kind of plays into some of the methodological questions or methodologies that I try to adopt.
Thank you. I'm seeing a raised hand. Elizabeth Bass, please. Yeah, there you are.
Hi, Dr. Karibeau.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great.
I know it's totally surprising to you, but I was very interested when you were talking about boomtowns. What was the proportion in the Darlington Center of men versus women? Just because, you talk about the boomtowns and the trafficking through there, and of course those areas were predominantly men. What was the proportion there of men versus women?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So here's an example of methodological challenges when there are no records about intake, or you can't trace that over time. The only indication about the number of people incarcerated or treated at Darlington came from those newspaper reports. And I think at that time there were between 40 and 50 male user inmates. And there were, I believe, about 12 in that. So certainly the proportion of male patient inmates was higher. And that's true in the records for arrest records as well. So in this period, we do see that users tend to, whether that's within an urban setting or a rural, say an oil boom town, and especially in an oil boom town, that's been sort of true across the board so far. And I think, in fact, that's reflected in the literature nationally. So that's not a regionally specific issue. But at Darlington, yeah, you certainly see it's a much larger proportion of men sent there. And that may reflect that there were more male users. It may reflect who the county boards determined was worth saving.
Yeah.
That, unfortunately, we don't get the records of what they were processing to think about, why particular individuals ended up there. But yeah, it's a great question.
One other quick
Sure.
observation with it being only open for 16 months and that being, it was a very volatile time in Oklahoma politics anyway, with Jack Walton and that thing. I wondered if some of that might have bled into why they were wanting to get rid of it so quickly. If it was a pet project of Walton, then perhaps it was something they wanted to get off the books after they got him out of office.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I go into the local history in the kind of broader chapter, or some of that context. And for those not familiar with any of that history, Walton's impeached. And so shortly before Darlington actually opens, and within 2 months of Governor Trapp taking over, he calls for the closing of the institution. So that is, I believe, also. So part of my broader argument I didn't get into here is that one of the issues with state-funded institutions is they're subject to state politics and funding challenges. And this is one perfect example, an institution that many were praising for, to be this forward-thinking, transformative institute that would be long-lasting, right? Within 2 months is slated for cancellation by the new governor. So that plays into the dynamics, I think, of localized treatment as well. But yeah, no, it's a great question. And I also situate this within the Tulsa Race Massacre and indigenous communities and a bit more in the broader chapter, but I'm still sort of working through that. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question comes from Frankie. Frankie?
Good evening. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Carribeau. That was so awesome.
Thank you.
Like what I said in my chat there, I'm a former drug addict. Uh, July 29th will be my 5 years clean. I stopped at 46. I'm 51 now. And for over 25 years, I was a drug addict because of horrible circumstances. And I just wanted to learn more about what you were talking about. It was so interesting. Like, wow. I became a drug addict because my dad was murdered in police custody in '99, and I was also part of the Indian Day School settlement where these teachers were raping a whole bunch of kids and beating kids. And currently I'm staying at Union Gospel Mission here in Vancouver, which is a rehabilitation center for drug addicts and drunk everybody. And I decided I wasn't ready for work when I finished a 6-month program. They offer a 18-month program after you're done. Twice in the past, I did go to treatment centers where there were 30 days, and there was no aftercare program after that. And I ended up by relapsing, just like what you talked about, because it seems when you're done the program that are funded by these governments, they don't really care for you after that because they were paid for. And they got their money and pushed us aside. Anyways, I just find it really interesting, and I just love to share my story. And if you guys want to check out my story, it's on UGM page, September 2020. You'll see my name, Frank E.T. Watts. It's an open to the public. And,
thank you so much. And,
yeah, that's it. Thank you.
oh, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think again, it's always a reminder to me that every person that we're talking about in the institution, but and some level it's an institutional history, but it's not how I want to think about the project, because I am more interested in the stakes and of what it meant to everyone who ended up there, no matter which route, sort of whether you're so-called voluntary, which is a whole nother debate and question about what that means in terms of addiction, or incarcerated by the state. And one thing I'll mention that you reminded me in your comments is the administrators at SPADRA were really critical of the federal narcotic farm model. And one of the things they were highly critical of is that when they were first established, and in fact, for the first couple of decades that they were in operation, they didn't have an aftercare program. And so this is something they begin to institute in the 1960s as an attempt to recognize that that became an important sort of critical, but it was late in the stage of the institution. And I think is something that the SPADRA administrators called in the 1930s and said, if you don't have an aftercare program, you're just replicating the same mistakes that we've been finding. So anyway, just the sort of the way they sort of wax and wane in terms of what the government decides to fund and what they find worthy in terms of the treatment program, I think is really important.
And I also wanted to say, Holly and Helen too, the one thing with these drug programs I noticed, like UGM is a Christian place, and a lot of the counselors they have here have never had drug addiction problems. These are people who got their masters in counseling or whatever else there is, but they have no family members or anybody that had drug problems. They never had families that had dealt with trauma like myself with residential school and murder. So, and that makes a big difference. I had to seek counsel outside of this place. And my counselor now with Watari Counseling is a native guy who went to treatment center. I mean, he went to, his family was in residential school, and he understood the traumas and losses of that. And
Sure.
That's what made a big difference.
Sure.
Thank you, Frankie, so much for sharing. And our next question comes from Sarah Griswold. Sarah? Sarah, I think you have to unmute as well.
I'm sorry. So Yeah, my internet connection is a little unstable, and if this doesn't come through, just let me know and I can put it in the chat. But my question is in some ways for Holly about process and how she ended up focusing on treatment and institutions. As you were talking, Holly, I was thinking about, you know, my field, which is European empire, and how there's been a lot of work recently about essentially kind of, you know, border control and regulation, which you looked at in your first book. So I just found myself wondering, you know, how you decided to focus on treatment and institutions to kind of tackle this story of drugs, and if you had any different kinds of avenues looking at this question of narcotics in kind of the early 20th century, avenues that you thought about doing and didn't go down and decided that treatment was the question you were really interested in.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the first book, Sin City North, I was more interested in using communities and smuggling networks across the U.S.-Canada border and Detroit-Windsor, and thinking about that social and cultural history and the role that sort of national borders play in either connecting or dividing communities. But looming as part of that project was always what happened to people, you know, when they're arrested, when they're incarcerated, and then when they're sent to these institutions. And so in some ways it sort of followed those questions, which is, you know, what happens to all of the people and the subjects that I'm studying that are kind of removed from their communities and, you know, sort of displaced in that way, and then end up in the criminal justice system. Certainly, I think the push and some of the shifts in mass incarceration studies had me thinking about the broader range of institutions that make up incarceration. And certainly, I think the drug treatment centers are part of that. And then, to be honest, it was pragmatic initially. I was teaching in North Texas, and right after after I finished my PhD, and I was near the institution. I was fascinated by it. I just started doing some, you know, initial research just and it sort of took off from there. Something I thought was going to be a short-term small project has sort of grown into just something that's, you know, sort of fascinated me. And your final question, originally I was really interested in women's roles in smuggling in alcohol prohibition on the U.S.-Canada and U.S.-Mexico borders, and trying to think comparatively about space and context. But it's just it's sort of, you know, the natural evolution of a project as you kind of start digging in archives and records and follow that way. So that's sort of where I ended up at the Fort Worth facility, both pragmatic and sort of intellectual, I think, questions.
We have time for one more question if anybody wants to ask that last question. If not, then I will invite Holly to tell us about the upcoming event that she's going to do, which is many of you, if you enjoyed today's talk, please go to the next one.
Yeah, so as part of the GSWS Read series as the 50th anniversary of the department, I'm going to be interviewing an author, Benjamin Hoy, University of Saskatchewan, next month. His new, I actually have the book here so I can just hold it up. His new book just came out. It's called A Line of Blood and Dirt, Creating the Canada-United States Border Across Indigenous Lands. And so it's going to be kind of a more informal conversation with the author, you know, just talking about process and arguments, and hopefully a chance for all of the participants to ask questions and engage with this new and sort of exciting book. So I'm hoping some of you can make it out, and it's June 18th, the Friday the 18th, I believe. So, and there'll be information posted on the GSWS website and in the chat right now as well. So.
If there is no more last question, then we can wrap here. And I want to thank Holly for just a truly fascinating talk. I want to thank everybody for participating and sharing your story and asking great questions. I, want to wish everybody a great Friday. It's very sunny over here where we are. I hope it is nice where you are as well. So thank you, Holly, and thank you to everyone.